Concerns?
Hey,
You. Step aside for additional screening.
I already went through the scanner. Is there a problem?
Yeah, there's a problem. You're the problem. Secondary screening. Now.
On what grounds?
On the grounds that I said so. You gonna cooperate, or do we need to do this the
What you just heard was the beginning of the end for Officer Derek Miller's career. On September 14th, 2025, at Denver International Airport, a seasoned TSA officer made a decision that would destroy everything he'd built over 15 years. He saw a black man in casual clothes carrying an expensive briefcase. And in that moment, he didn't see a citizen. He didn't see a professional. He saw what he wanted to see, a target. For 3 hours, Officer Miller and his team detained, mocked, and humiliated this traveler. They went through his personal documents. They questioned how he could afford his lifestyle. One officer even physically tripped him, scattering his belongings across the floor. They laughed. They joked. They felt powerful. What they didn't know was that the man standing before them wasn't just any traveler. He was United States District Court Judge Marcus Sterling, one of the most respected federal judges in the Western District. And in exactly 63 days, Officer Miller would see him again. But this time, Judge Sterling wouldn't be the one looking up. This is the story of how racial profiling at an airport terminal led to a courtroom reckoning that changed an entire department forever. Before we continue, I want to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your country or city in the comments right now. Are you from the USA, UK, Canada, or somewhere else? Let me know in the comment. And if you think accountability matters, hit that like button. Marcus Sterling was born in South Philadelphia in 1978 to a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep him in school. He graduated top of his class from Howard University, then earned his law degree from Yale. By age 35, he was a federal prosecutor with a 94% conviction rate. At 42, he was appointed to the United States District Court for the District of Colorado by presidential nomination, one of the youngest black federal judges in the nation. For 12 years, Judge Sterling presided over high-profile cases ranging from civil rights violations to federal corruption trials. He was known for 3 things: his photographic memory, his commitment to constitutional law, and his absolute intolerance for abuse of power. Despite his status, Marcus Sterling lived modestly. He drove a 10-year-old sedan, he shopped at regular grocery stores. And when he traveled, he often wore sweatpants and a Howard University hoodie, his way of staying grounded, he'd say. His colleagues called him the people's judge, because he never forgot where he came from. He was married to Dr. Angela Sterling, a pediatric surgeon, for 18 years. They had 2 teenage daughters. On weekends, he volunteered at a legal aid clinic in Denver, offering free counsel to those who couldn't afford representation. On September 14, 2025, Judge Sterling was traveling to a 3-day legal symposium in Washington, D.C. He had a first-class ticket, a rare splurge paid for by the conference organizers. He arrived at Denver International Airport at 11:30 a.m., 2 hours before his 1:45 p.m. departure. He was wearing his Howard hoodie, jeans, and white sneakers. His wedding ring and a modest Seiko watch were his only accessories. He expected a routine trip. What he got instead was a masterclass in institutional racism. Officer Derek Miller was 38 years old and had been with the Transportation Security Administration since 2010. For 15 years, he wore the uniform with what he believed was pride. But his personnel file told a different story. Miller had 7 formal complaints filed against him over his career. 4 involved accusations of racial profiling. 2 involved excessive use of authority during passenger screenings. 1 involved inappropriate comments made to a female traveler. Each time, internal reviews found insufficient evidence or resulted in nothing more than a written warning. His supervisor, Stephen Kowalski, had noted in a 2023 performance review that Miller had difficulty de-escalating situations and a tendency to view certain passengers as inherently suspicious. But Miller was never disciplined beyond mandatory retraining courses he openly mocked in the break room. Colleagues described Miller as someone who loved the power of the badge. He was known for pulling aside travelers he deemed out of place in first-class lines. He frequently made comments about passengers who carried luxury items, suggesting they were stolen or purchased with illegal money. And he had a particular pattern. 73% of his random secondary screenings over the previous 2 years involved Black or Latino travelers, according to later federal data analysis. On the morning of September 14th, Officer Miller clocked in for his 10 a.m. shift at Concourse B security checkpoint. He was in a foul mood, his ex-wife had just filed for increased child support, and he'd been passed over for a promotion the week before. He was looking for someone to take it out on. At 11:47 a.m., he found his target. I have a question for you. Do you think officers should face consequences for illegal stops? Or should they get away with it? Comment below with your thoughts. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we bring you real stories of justice and accountability every single week. At 11:47 a.m., Judge Marcus Sterling approached Security Checkpoint 4 in Concourse B. He placed his briefcase, shoes, belt, and jacket into the gray bins. He walked through the scanner without incident. The machine didn't beep. There were no alerts. But Officer Derek Miller was watching. Miller saw a black man in a hoodie carrying a leather Toomey briefcase that retailed for $800. He saw first-class luggage tags. He saw confidence in Sterling's posture, the kind of confidence that Miller interpreted as arrogance. As Sterling began collecting his belongings, Miller stepped forward. "Sir, step aside. You've been selected for additional screening." Sterling looked up, his expression neutral. "Is there a specific reason?" Miller's jaw tightened. "Random selection." "Step over here. It wasn't random." And both men knew it. Sterling complied without argument. He moved to the designated secondary screening area, a cordoned-off section with a metal table and 2 additional TSA officers standing nearby. Miller's partner, Officer Janet Reeves, joined them. For the next 6 minutes, Sterling stood with his arms extended as Miller performed an aggressive pat-down. Miller's hands lingered longer than necessary. He pressed harder than procedure required. He made comments under his breath. "Nice watch," Miller said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "What do you do for a living?" Sterling remained calm. "I'm an attorney." Miller smirked. "Must be nice. Most attorneys I know don't dress like they're heading to the gym." At 11:54 a.m., Miller opened Sterling's briefcase without asking permission. Inside were legal documents, a laptop, and a leather portfolio. Miller began pulling items out carelessly, tossing them onto the table. Several confidential case files, clearly marked with federal court stamps, scattered across the surface. Sterling's voice remained measured. "Those are confidential legal documents. I'd appreciate it if you'd handle them with care." Miller looked up, his expression mocking. "Oh, you'd appreciate it? Well, I'd appreciate it if you'd stop acting like you're better than everybody else." Officer Reeves shifted uncomfortably. She could sense the interaction was heading somewhere inappropriate, but she said nothing. At 11:58 a.m., Miller held up Sterling's first-class boarding pass. "First class to D.C., huh? Must be nice, flying with the rich folks." "How'd you afford that?" "Most public defenders I know are broke." Sterling's eyes narrowed slightly, the first crack in his composure. "I'm not a public defender." "Oh, excuse me," Miller said with exaggerated sarcasm. "Big-time lawyer." "Still doesn't explain this." He tapped Sterling's watch. "This real, or is it one of those Canal Street knockoffs?" At 12:03 p.m., something inside Miller seemed to snap. He told Sterling he needed to conduct a full bag inspection in a private screening room. Sterling's voice was firm now. "On what grounds? You've already searched my bag. I've been through the scanner. What is the legal basis for further detention?" Miller stepped closer, invading Sterling's personal space. "The legal basis is that I say so." "You got a problem with that?" Sterling stared at him for a long moment. Then he said calmly, "I'd like your badge number, please." Miller's face flushed red. "You want my badge number? Are you threatening me?" "I'm exercising my right to file a complaint." Miller's supervisor, Stephen Kowalski, approached the commotion. Instead of de-escalating, he sided with Miller immediately. "Sir, if you don't cooperate, we can have airport police escort you out of this terminal. Is that what you want?" Sterling took a slow breath. He was a federal judge. He could have ended this with 5 words, "I'm a United States District Court judge." But he didn't, because he wanted to see exactly how far they would go when they thought no one important was watching. "I'll comply," Sterling said quietly, "but I'm asking again for badge numbers." Miller sneered. "People like you don't give orders here." At 12:09 p.m., Sterling was escorted to a small detention room, a windowless space typically used for suspected smugglers. Officer Miller and Officer Reeves followed him inside. Supervisor Kowalski stood in the doorway. For the next 2 hours and 43 minutes, Judge Marcus Sterling was held in that room. They didn't find contraband. They didn't find anything illegal. What they did was humiliate him. Miller made him remove his shoes again, then his socks, then his hoodie. He was asked invasive questions about his income, his travel history, his vehicle, his home address. Miller pulled up Sterling's driver's license on the system and made comments about his neighborhood. "Northeast Denver, huh? That's a nice area. You rent, or did someone help you buy?" At 1:32 p.m., Sterling's flight departed without him. At 1:45 p.m., Miller finally opened the door and told Sterling he was free to go. "Didn't find anything suspicious after all," Miller said with a smirk. "Have a great day, counselor." As Sterling gathered his belongings, his legal documents now wrinkled and out of order, Miller deliberately stepped in front of him. Sterling, carrying his briefcase and shoes, tried to step around him. That's when Miller stuck his foot out. Sterling tripped. His briefcase hit the floor. Papers scattered everywhere. His laptop slid across the tile. Miller and Reeves both laughed. "Oops," Miller said. "Watch your step." Judge Marcus Sterling knelt on the cold airport floor, collecting his documents in silence. His face was unreadable. His hands moved methodically, carefully stacking each page. He didn't look at Miller. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply remembered. At 2:04 p.m., Sterling walked out of that detention room. He had missed his flight. He had been humiliated. His expensive conference registration was wasted. But Officer Derek Miller had just made the worst mistake of his life. Because Judge Sterling didn't just remember faces. He remembered names, badge numbers, timestamps, everything. And he knew something Miller didn't. In exactly 9 weeks, the Denver TEA office was scheduled to appear in federal court as a defendant in a civil rights lawsuit filed by the ACLU. The case involved systemic racial profiling at airport checkpoints. The judge assigned to that case? Marcus Sterling. Pause for a second. If you believe body cameras save lives and expose the truth, smash that like button right now. Also, comment justice if you think this officer got what he deserved. I read every single comment, and I want to hear your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Judge Marcus Sterling left Denver International Airport at 2:47 p.m. on September 14th. He rebooked his flight for the next morning. When he arrived home that evening, his wife, Dr. Angela Sterling, immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked. Marcus sat at their kitchen table and told her everything. Angela was furious. She wanted him to call the director immediately. She wanted him to use his position to destroy the officers who had humiliated him. But Marcus shook his head. "Not yet," he said quietly. "If I reveal who I am now, they'll claim it was a misunderstanding. They'll apologize. They'll say they didn't know. And they'll walk away with a slap on the wrist." Angela stared at her husband. "So what are you going to do?" Marcus looked at her, and for the first time that day, he smiled. "I'm going to wait." For the next 63 days, Judge Marcus Sterling said nothing publicly about the incident. He didn't file a personal complaint. He didn't contact TSA leadership. He didn't call the media. But he did 3 things. First, he requested all security footage from Checkpoint 4 on September 14th between 11:30 a.m. and 3 p.m. As a federal judge, he had the authority to subpoena records in connection with ongoing federal cases. The footage was delivered to his chambers within a week. Second, he pulled Officer Derek Miller's complete personnel file. What he found confirmed everything he suspected: a 15-year pattern of racial profiling, ignored complaints, and a department that consistently protected bad actors. Third, he quietly contacted the ACLU attorneys handling the upcoming civil rights case against the Denver TSA. He informed them that he had first-hand evidence of racial profiling at the very checkpoint mentioned in their lawsuit. He offered to provide a sworn deposition not as a judge, but as a witness and victim. The ACLU attorneys were stunned. A federal judge was willing to testify about being racially profiled by the agency being sued? This changed everything. On November 18, 2025, the case of Coalition for Traveler Rights v. Transportation Security Administration, Denver Division was scheduled for initial hearing in the United States District Court for the District of Colorado. The TSA sent a team of attorneys, confident they could dismiss the case as they had so many others. After all, it was hard to prove racial profiling when officers could simply claim random selection. Officer Derek Miller was named as one of 12 defendants in the case. He'd been served papers 3 weeks earlier, but he wasn't worried. He'd been through internal reviews before. They always went nowhere. On the morning of November 18th, Miller walked into the federal courthouse wearing his dress uniform. His supervisor, Stephen Kowalski, was beside him. Their attorney, a seasoned government defense lawyer named Richard Parsons, assured them this would be routine. Federal judges dismiss these cases all the time, Parsons said. Just let me do the talking. They entered Courtroom 4 at 9:45 a.m. The room was impressive: high ceilings, dark wood paneling, the seal of the United States District Court mounted behind the judge's bench. Miller had never been in a federal courtroom before. Despite his bravado, he felt a flutter of nervousness. The plaintiff's table was crowded with ACLU attorneys and several Black and Latino travelers who claimed they'd been profiled. Miller glanced at them dismissively. At 9:58 a.m., the bailiff entered from a side door. All rise. The United States District Court for the District of Colorado is now in session, the Honorable Judge Marcus Sterling presiding. Miller stood automatically, his mind barely registering the name. The side door opened, and Judge Marcus Sterling walked in. He wore the black robes of his office. His posture was straight, his expression professional. He climbed the steps to the bench, sat down, and arranged his papers with the same methodical precision Miller had seen once before. Officer Derek Miller's stomach dropped. His face went white. His hands started trembling. Next to him, Supervisor Kowalski whispered, "Oh my God." Judge Sterling looked up from his paperwork. His eyes swept across the courtroom, past the plaintiff's table, past the gallery, and landed directly on the defense table. On Officer Derek Miller. Their eyes met. Sterling's expression didn't change. He didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He simply held Miller's gaze for 3 long seconds. Then he spoke. "Good morning. Please be seated." Miller collapsed into his chair. His attorney, Richard Parsons, leaned over. "Do you know him?" Miller couldn't speak. He could only nod. "From where?" Miller's voice came out as a whisper. "The airport." Parsons' face went pale. "What?" The reality was setting in. The man Miller had detained, mocked, and physically tripped 2 months ago was now sitting 15 feet away in a position of absolute authority. And this wasn't just any case. This was a case specifically about racial profiling by TSA officers. Officers like Derek Miller. Judge Sterling opened the case file. This is case number 2025 CV 03847. Coalition for Traveler Rights versus the Transportation Security Administration, Denver Division, and 12 individually named defendants. Is the defense ready to proceed? Richard Parsons stood shakily. "Your Honor, We request a brief recess. There may be a conflict of... Denied, Sterling said calmly. We're here for initial motions. You'll have your opportunity to speak. Sit down, counselor. Parsons sat. For the next 45 minutes, Judge Sterling listened to opening arguments from both sides. The accused laid out their case, statistical evidence showing that Black and Latino travelers were 3 times more likely to be subjected to secondary screenings at Denver's airport. Witness testimony from dozens of travelers who described humiliating experiences. Patterns of behavior from specific officers. When it was the defense's turn, their attorney argued that all screenings were random, that officers followed protocol, and that there was no evidence of intentional discrimination. Judge Sterling listened without interruption. Then he said, I'd like to address something before we proceed further. The courtroom went silent. This court has a duty to ensure fairness and impartiality. To that end, I need to disclose something to both parties. Miller's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst. On September 14th of this year, I was traveling through Denver International Airport. I was subjected to what the SA classified as a random secondary screening at Checkpoint 4. I was detained for approximately 2 hours and 50 minutes. During that detention, I was questioned about my income, my profession, my possessions, and my right to travel in first class. My confidential legal documents were handled carelessly, and at the conclusion of the screening, I was physically tripped by one of the officers, causing me to drop my belongings. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Sterling raised his hand for silence. The officer who detained me is seated in this courtroom today. Officer Derek Miller, please stand. Miller's legs wouldn't move. Kowalski had to grab his arm and pull him to his feet. Judge Sterling looked directly at him. Officer Miller, do you remember me? Miller's voice cracked. Yes, Your Honor. Do you remember what you said to me when I asked for your badge number? Silence. You said, and I quote, people like you don't give orders here. Do you recall that? I didn't know. You didn't know I was a judge, Sterling interrupted. That's correct. But let me ask you this. Would it have mattered if I was a plumber? A teacher? A mechanic? Does someone need to be a federal judge to deserve basic dignity and respect? Miller said nothing. This court has reviewed the security footage from September 14th. It has also reviewed your personnel file, Officer Miller. 7 formal complaints in 15 years, 4 specifically alleging racial profiling. And yet, you remain employed. Sterling turned to the defense table. I am disclosing this information because I want both parties to understand that I have personal knowledge of the behavior described in this lawsuit. I have experienced it firsthand. Now, the defense has the right to request that I recuse myself from this case on the grounds of personal bias. Richard Parsons stood slowly. Every instinct told him to ask for recusal, but he also knew that any other judge would see the same evidence. And if they asked Sterling to recuse himself, they'd be admitting their officer's behavior was indefensible. Your Honor, Parsons said carefully, the defense trusts in your impartiality and does not request recusal at this time. It was a calculated gamble. And it failed. Judge Sterling nodded. Very well. Then let's proceed. What happened over the next 90 minutes was a legal dismantling unlike anything that Courtroom had seen. Judge Sterling allowed the accused to present their statistical evidence without interruption. Then he did something unprecedented. He offered his own testimony as a witness, stepping down from the bench temporarily while another judge was brought in to hear his sworn statement. For 30 minutes, Judge Marcus Sterling described every detail of September 14th. The unnecessary pat-down, the invasive questions, the mocking comments about his watch and his first-class ticket, the detention without cause, the carelessly handled documents, and finally, the moment Officer Miller tripped him and laughed. When he finished, he returned to the bench. The defense had no rebuttal. How could they? Their own officer had profiled a federal judge. Judge Sterling made his ruling from the bench that same day, a rarity in federal court. This court finds sufficient evidence to proceed to trial on all claims. Furthermore, this court is ordering an immediate independent investigation into the hiring, training, and disciplinary practices of the TSA Denver Division. Officer Derek Miller is hereby ordered to surrender his credentials pending the outcome of this trial. Supervisor Stephen Kowalski is suspended without pay for failure to intervene in a clear civil rights violation. Miller's legs gave out. He collapsed back into his chair. But Judge Sterling wasn't finished. One more thing. Officer Miller, you told me that people like me don't give orders. You were wrong. In this courtroom, I do give orders. And here's mine. You will sit through every day of this trial. You will hear every witness describe what you and officers like you have done to them. And when this is over, you will face the consequences of your actions. The gavel came down. This court is adjourned. The ruling sent shockwaves through the Transportation Security Administration. Within 48 hours, the TSA's Office of Inspection launched a full internal investigation into the Denver Division. Federal investigators from the Department of Homeland Security's Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties were dispatched to review every secondary screening conducted at Denver International Airport over the previous 3 years. What they found was damning. The data analysis revealed a systematic pattern of racial bias. Over a 36-month period, Black travelers represented 7% of total passengers at Denver International, but accounted for 24% of secondary screenings. Latino travelers represented 12% of passengers, but 31% of secondary screenings. White travelers, who made up 68% of passengers, accounted for only 39% of secondary screenings. Officer Derek Miller's record was particularly egregious. Of the 847 secondary screenings he had conducted over 3 years, 619, that's 73%, involved passengers of color. His rate of finding suspicious items was statistically identical across all racial groups, proving that his targeting was not based on legitimate security concerns. The investigation also uncovered something else, a culture of silence. 14 SA officers came forward confidentially to report that they had witnessed Miller and other officers making racially charged comments in the break room. Phrases like "check the ones who look out of place" and "first class" doesn't mean first rate were common. Several officers said they had reported concerns to supervisors, only to be told to mind their own business. Supervisor Stephen Kowalski's own emails became evidence. In one message to a fellow supervisor, he wrote, "Miller's got instincts. He knows who to watch." In another, responding to a complaint about Miller's behavior, "Passenger probably had an attitude. Back your officers." The security footage from September 14th was entered into evidence and viewed by investigators frame by frame. At timestamp 11:54:33, Miller is seen carelessly tossing Judge Sterling's legal documents. At timestamp 12:03:17, Miller is seen stepping into Sterling's personal space in an aggressive posture. At timestamp 13:47:09, Sterling is visible through the small window of the detention room, sitting alone with his head in his hands. At timestamp 14:52,041, the moment that would define the entire case, Officer Miller deliberately extends his foot as Judge Sterling walks past. Sterling trips. His briefcase crashes to the floor, and both Miller and Officer Reeves laugh. That 10-second clip was played in every news broadcast in America within a week. The investigation expanded beyond Denver. The Department of Homeland Security ordered audits of SA practices at 12 major airports nationwide. Similar patterns emerged in 8 of them. Officer Janet Reeves, who had stood by during Sterling's detention, cooperated with investigators. In exchange for immunity, she provided testimony that Miller had specifically said, "Let's see how long Mr. First Class can wait," before detaining Sterling for nearly 3 hours. She also revealed that Miller had bragged about the incident in the break room the next day, saying he put some lawyer in his place. By early December 2025, the evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't just one bad officer. It was an institutional failure that had allowed officers like Derek Miller to abuse their authority for years without consequence. The accused lawsuit, initially seeking policy reforms and modest damages, was amended. They now sought $47 million in damages on behalf of 83 identified victims of racial profiling, plus comprehensive federal oversight of TSA practices nationwide. And Judge Marcus Sterling's personal lawsuit, filed separately on December 3, 2025, sought $8.5 million in damages for civil rights violations, emotional distress, and punitive damages. The TSA's attorneys knew they couldn't win at trial. The evidence was too strong. The judge was too credible. And the optics were catastrophic. A federal judge racially profiled and humiliated by the very agency charged with protecting travelers. Settlement negotiations began in January 2026. But Officer Derek Miller's nightmare was just beginning. Officer Miller's downfall. On December 8, 2025, exactly 85 days after he tripped Judge Marcus Sterling in an airport hallway, Officer Derek Miller was terminated from the Transportation Security Administration. The termination letter cited gross misconduct, violation of civil rights, insubordination, and conduct unbecoming of a federal officer. He lost his pension eligibility. His federal benefits were revoked. His security clearance was permanently suspended, but losing his job was only the beginning. On January 14, 2026, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Colorado filed federal criminal charges against Miller: deprivation of rights under color of law, a violation of 18 U.S. 242. If convicted, Miller faced up to 10 years in federal prison. His attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal. The prosecution offered him 2 years in prison and 5 years of supervised release. Miller refused, insisting he had done nothing wrong. That decision would haunt him. The trial began on March 3, 2026. Judge Marcus Sterling, ethically prohibited from presiding over a case in which he was the victim, watched from the gallery as another federal judge heard the evidence. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, guilty on all counts. On May 12, 2026, Derek Miller was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. At his sentencing hearing, Judge Raymond Kellerman addressed him directly. "Mr. Miller, you were given a badge and the public's trust. You were tasked with keeping travelers safe. Instead, you weaponized your authority against those you deemed unworthy of respect. You targeted people based on the color of their skin, and when you were caught, you showed no remorse." This sentence reflects not just what you did to Judge Sterling, but what you represent: the abuse of power that erodes public trust in our institutions. Miller was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. His ex-wife released a statement saying she was relieved and hoped her children would learn that actions have consequences. Officer Janet Reeves, who cooperated with investigators, was suspended for 6 months without pay and demoted. She was required to complete 200 hours of civil rights training and remains under probationary status. Supervisor Stephen Kowalski was also terminated. His failure to intervene, combined with his documented pattern of protecting Miller despite complaints, made him legally liable. He was not charged criminally but lost his pension and was barred from federal employment for life. The TSA terminated 8 other officers at Denver International Airport for similar patterns of racial profiling. 17 others were suspended or demoted. Judge Sterling's vindication. On February 20, 2026, the Transportation Security Administration settled Judge Marcus Sterling's personal lawsuit for $8.5 million, one of the largest individual settlements in ESA history. But Judge Sterling didn't keep the money. In a press conference on the courthouse steps, he announced that he was donating $7 million of the settlement to the accused Racial Justice Legal Defense Fund. Another $1 million went to establish a scholarship fund for students from underserved communities pursuing careers in law. He kept $500,000 to cover his legal fees. This was never about money, Sterling said to the assembled reporters. This was about accountability. This was about proving that no one, regardless of their position or lack thereof, should be subjected to the humiliation I experienced. If my experience can prevent this from happening to even one other traveler, then the 3 hours I spent in that room were worth it. The clip of his statement went viral, viewed more than 60 million times across social media platforms. Judge Sterling returned to his bench 3 weeks later. He continued to preside over cases with the same integrity and fairness that had defined his career. But he also became a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform and police accountability. In interviews, he often said, "I had the education, the resources, and the position to fight back. Most people don't. We have to build systems that protect everyone, not just those with power." Systemic change. The fallout from the Sterling case forced the TSA to implement sweeping reforms. In March 2026, the Department of Homeland Security announced a $340 million initiative to overhaul TSA training and accountability measures nationwide. Key reforms included mandatory bias training. All 60,000 TSA officers were required to complete 40 hours of implicit bias and de-escalation training annually. Data transparency. TSA was ordered to publicly report demographic data on all secondary screenings at every major airport quarterly. Independent oversight. A civilian review board was established to investigate complaints of racial profiling or misconduct. Body cameras. TSA officers conducting secondary screenings were required to wear body cameras, with footage automatically uploaded to a secure server. Accountability metrics. Officers with statistically significant disparities in their screening patterns were flagged for review and potential reassignment. Whistleblower protections. Officers who reported misconduct by colleagues were granted federal whistleblower protections. The reforms were officially named the Sterling Accountability Standards. The class action lawsuit on behalf of 83 other victims settled for $47 million in April 2026. Each plaintiff received compensation ranging from $150,000 to $1.2 million, depending on the severity of their experience. By June 2026, 9 other airports had implemented similar reforms voluntarily, hoping to avoid the legal and financial consequences that Denver had faced. The human cost. But for all the policy victories and financial settlements, the human cost remained. Judge Marcus Sterling still travels frequently for legal conferences, and he still sometimes wears his Howard University hoodie. But he admits that walking through airport security now triggers anxiety he never felt before September 14, 2025. "I'm a federal judge," he said in a later interview. "I have power and resources that most people will never have. And even I felt powerless in that moment. I think about all the travelers who experienced the same thing I did, but who didn't have the platform to fight back. That's what keeps me up at night." Derek Miller is currently serving his sentence at FCI Inglewood, a low-security federal prison in Colorado. He'll be eligible for parole in 2031. His children no longer speak to him. His ex-wife has remarried. In a jailhouse interview conducted by a civil rights documentary filmmaker, Miller was asked if he had any regrets. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I thought I was just doing my job." The interviewer pressed, "Do you understand now that what you did was wrong?" Miller looked down at his hands. "I understand that I lost everything. That wasn't the same as understanding why. If this story proves that accountability matters, do 3 things right now. Smash that like button. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of justice. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. And comment below, do you think body cameras should be mandatory for all officers? Let's discuss. The story of Judge Marcus Sterling and Officer Derek Miller is more than a tale of justice served. It's a reminder of something we often forget. Respect should never be conditional. Derek Miller didn't see a human being that day in September. He saw a skin color and an opportunity to exert power. He made assumptions based on appearance. He believed that a black man in a hoodie couldn't possibly belong in first class, and because he held a badge, he felt entitled to act on those assumptions. But here's the truth that Miller learned too late. Dignity isn't determined by position. A person's worth isn't measured by their title or their salary or the clothes they wear. Judge Sterling could have ended that encounter in 30 seconds. He could have shown his judicial credentials. He could have made a phone call that would have had Miller fired on the spot. But he didn't, because he wanted to experience what millions of other travelers, people without power, without platforms, without protection, experience every single day. And then he did something extraordinary. He used his power not for personal revenge, but for systemic change. The Sterling accountability standards are now being implemented at airports across the nation. Thousands of TSA officers are receiving training that will make them better at their jobs and more respectful of the people they serve. And dozens of travelers who suffered similar humiliation finally received acknowledgement and compensation. This is what accountability looks like. Body cameras didn't just capture Derek Miller's misconduct, they exposed an entire culture of abuse that had been hiding in plain sight. When officers know they're being watched, behavior changes. When victims have evidence, justice becomes possible. But we can't stop here. Accountability can't just be a response to viral videos and high-profile cases. It has to be built into the system. Every traffic stop, every security checkpoint, every interaction between those with power and those without. Because the next person subjected to racial profiling might not be a federal judge. They might be a teacher, a nurse, a student, someone's parent, someone's child, and they deserve the same dignity that we all do. So the next time you see injustice, whether it's at an airport, on a street corner, or in your own community, remember Judge Marcus Sterling. Remember that change is possible. Remember that speaking up matters. And remember that accountability isn't just about punishing bad actors. It's about building a world where everyone, regardless of their race, their job, or their zip code, is treated with basic human respect. This is Real Justice Stories, reminding you to stay informed, stay aware, and always demand accountability, because you never know if the person you're looking down on today is the one you'll be looking up to tomorrow. Until next time.